The transition of power is always the most dangerous moment for democracies. Every historian will tell you that. We just saw it in the most astonishing way. We lived through it. And you know what? The framers of our Constitution knew it.
We are really here because the majority in the House of Representatives does not want to face Donald Trump as a political rival in the future. That's the real reason we're here.
If you were watching the impeachment proceedings throughout the day against former President Donald Trump, you saw that it started off with a debate over whether the charges are constitutional, also with a history lesson on American government.
Prosecutors spent the afternoon arguing against what they call the January exception. The historic second impeachment trial opened in the Senate with graphic video of the deadly January 6th attack on Congress, along with a defeated former president whipping up a rally crowd. It was an emotionally charged video, especially for those who were there that day. The 15-minute video provided a timeline of some of the images we've been seeing from the insurrection, combined with Trump's speeches and tweets, and what was happening inside the House and Senate chambers. Trump is charged by the House with inciting the violent mob attack on the U.S. Capitol to overturn the election.
The House managers pointed to past impeachments and statements from our founding fathers to make the case that without the threat of impeachment, an outgoing president or other government official could do whatever they want, then resign before punishment. They also argued that a failure to impeach and hold a trial would empower the next president who disagrees with election results to take drastic measures to hold on to power without fear of any personal consequences.
Indeed, that's one specific reason the impeachment, conviction, and disqualification powers exist: to protect us against presidents who try to overrun the power of the people in their elections and replace the rule of law with the rule of mobs. These powers must apply even if the president commits his offenses in his final weeks in office. In fact, that's precisely when we need them the most.
During their opening statement, Trump's defense team also used quotes from our founding fathers to argue against impeaching a former president and calling the process rushed. In the last hour, one of the attorneys representing Trump called for the case to be dismissed because of a lack of due process. They also leaned heavily into their First Amendment argument.
I don't expect, and I don't believe that the former president expects anybody to walk back any of the language. If that's how they feel about the way things transpired over the last couple of years in this country, they should be allowed to say that. And I will go to court and defend them if anything happens to them as a result. If the government takes action against that state representative or that U.S. representative who wants to walk back her comments, the government takes action against her, I have no problem going into court and defending her right to say those things, even though I don't agree with them.
Another reminder, you can watch the trial live right now and every day on 11alive.com and the 11 Alive app. And even when the trial is not in session, you can check the app for all of the latest updates on the case.